All right, welcome back to Counterpoint. Happy Wednesday. I'm Emily Dushinsky, joined by my co-host Ryan Grimm, who is still remote for the time being. Ryan, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'll be back pretty soon. Looking forward to seeing you and everybody in the studio, but also been nice to be away, gotta say.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine. It's a good time to be away from the swamp, that's for sure. Speaking of all of the craziness in the swamp, we're going to be tackling all kinds of good stuff today. That would be starting with Georgia, the fallout from the latest Trump indictment. We have a lot to break down in terms of how Trump has responded, how his fellow Republican candidates have responded. We're going to talk about Chris Christie in a recent poll in New Hampshire taking the edge over Ron DeSantis. He's actually leading Ron DeSantis. We're going to talk about that in one poll. The likelihood of a government shutdown increases by the day. We'll probably see some real threats of that going into the fall. Kevin McCarthy has new things to talk about on that. We're going to talk about the cycle of tragedy in Ecuador, which is an important place to look at U.S. policy. It's an important place to look at what's happening in South America, Central America in general. And we're going to be breaking down a little bit of both of our takes on what's happening with the blindside controversy, Michael Oher, and the family who famously took him in, whether or not there's truth to their story. We're going to get into all of it. I'm going to be talking about Hillary Clinton weighing in on the Trump indictment in a very giggly interview with Rachel Maddow. Ryan, you're going to be talking about Pakistan again.
Yeah, we've got to follow up on that. Shortly after we broke the news on the show here last week, the State Department was pressed on this secret cable that demonstrated that the U.S. had, in fact, pushed Imran Khan out of power in Pakistan. In a recent interview, the outgoing prime minister has now authenticated the document because there were some people who would take a kind of three-step approach. They'd say, this document is inauthentic. This document was leaked by Imran Khan, and it's a treasonous act. It was not leaked by Imran Khan. And also, it's a nothing burger. So they would, all three kind of self-contradictory claims would be made at once. And it seems like now they're finally giving up on the inauthentic claim. And we'll talk about the completely bizarre State Department response as well. But speaking of jailing political opponents, we've got number 4 for good old former President Donald Trump. We've got RICO charges. What do you make of the case that's being laid out?
Yeah, the RICO charges is specifically something I wanted to ask you about because you've covered cases like this for a while, and Fani Willis is a big fan of RICO, has used it in the past. And before we even get into that, I think it's worth mentioning Donald Trump himself says, we can put A1 up on the screen here. He posted a Truth Social yesterday morning, so Tuesday morning, saying that a large, complex, detailed, but irrefutable report on the presidential election fraud, which took place in Georgia, is almost complete and will be presented by me at a major news conference at 11 a.m. on Monday of next week in Bedminster, New Jersey. Based on the results of this conclusive report, all charges should be dropped against me and others. There will be a complete exoneration. So Donald Trump is having a press conference where he is going to be, according to this Truth Social post, putting on display, demonstrating and showing evidence for what he says is an irrefutable case that there was fraud in Georgia and all of the charges against him should be dropped. Now, let's put A2 up on the screen. There have been some interesting reactions from Donald Trump's fellow candidates. Vivek Ramaswamy said, he called this another disastrous Trump indictment. And he also said, as someone who's running for president against Trump, I'd volunteer to write the amicus brief to the court myself. Prosecutors should not be deciding U.S. presidential elections. And if they're so overzealous that they commit constitutional violations, then the cases should be thrown out and they should be held accountable. Ron DeSantis said he's going to end the weaponization of federal agencies like the DOJ and FBI. I think it's an example of this criminalization of politics. I don't think this is something that's good for the country. And then, you have your Asa Hutchinsons and Will Hurd who said things, that this is like Donald Trump demonstrating he's unfit for office, basically what you could expect from those two. I think is another great example of how Ramaswamy has a better comm strategy as somebody running in the Trump lane or the Trump adjacent lane than Ron DeSantis, who's supposed to be running in like the Trump adjacent lane, the Trump but not Trump lane. Once again, I think Ramaswamy had a better messaging strategy there than DeSantis himself did. But as for the case itself, Ryan, As I read through the 98-page indictment from Fani Willis, had a pretty similar reaction to when I read through Jack Smith's indictment, which is that it's very dangerous to say that people were, and this word comes up over and over again in both indictments, knowingly spreading false information. So this is, I think, the predicate of both cases. And in Jack Smith's case, and a couple of times in Willis's case, she does show that there were people who knew they were spreading false information in certain particular instances. She also, and Jack Smith also, accuses people like Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani of knowingly spreading disinformation, information they were aware was false, in times where I don't think they've proved, and I doubt they have the evidence to prove that those people knew it was false. Now, I think it was grossly unethical because I imagine a lot of times they did realize some of this information was at best very, very iffy. But to charge people for that without evidence, I think is a pretty terrifying precedent. There are cases where they're citing evidence in both of these indictments, and I want to be clear about that. I also think that as a predicate for, going after a political opponent, which is something that we've generally steered away from in this country. People weren't happy when Ford pardoned Nixon. And we can go back and think about that. We can think about what Comey did with Hillary Clinton. But we've typically sort of steered away from that in the United States. So if you're going to do it, I think it sets a precedent that scares me a little bit to say, oh, well, of course they knew it was false without any evidence. And in order to charge them with the conspiracy and in order to charge them with the statutes that Fani Willis is listing, you do need to prove that they knew it was false. So maybe she can do that. I'm pretty skeptical. What did you make of it, Ryan?
I mean, if all that they were doing was spreading false information, I would 100% agree with you and say that we cannot go down the road of criminalizing lies. Now, you have a First Amendment right as a politician to lie. All politicians lie. Now, you don't have the right to do it on YouTube. Apparently, they'll take you down for that. But broadly speaking, under the constitutional umbrella, politicians have the constitutional right to lie their pants off, and they have availed themselves of that right for 200 plus years, and they will continue to do it for as long as this republic exists. But if the lies are linked up with action, and that action is itself illegal, then it does matter. And to me, the most blatant kind of illegal acts that are very hard to explain away. And hey, innocent until proven guilty, these 19 guys and women can go before the jury and try to explain away what they did. But to me, the hacking, trying to bust into the Georgia voter database, which they sort of seem to imply they had some access to legitimately, but it wasn't really legitimate. Like, this was not kind of public access that they were exploiting here. And also the go and find me 11,000 votes, and then also creating fake electors. Like, if you run a fake ID business, if you falsify mortgage documents, if you engage in that type of fraud, those are crimes. And so if they can prove that, I do think then it does have to follow that it doesn't actually necessarily have to follow that they knew 100% that the election was stolen. And what I mean is this: like, let's pretend that we can get inside of Donald Trump's mind, and he really did 100% believe that he beat Joe Biden in Georgia. He also knows that you have a variety of legal paths that you're able to take in the United States that allow you to challenge what you consider to be an unfair or a rigged election. And that's mostly going through the courts. They went through the courts, they failed. They knew that was the outcome. So even if at the end of all that, they still believe that they were wronged, it kind of doesn't matter what you believe. Like, if you believe that you were unfairly convicted of burglary, it doesn't give you the right to break out of prison, even if you authentically believed and were even innocent. And so we have rules, this is not Vietnam, as they say. And they didn't follow the rules. They went outside of it and used all of these extrajudicial, extra-legal processes to try to overturn the election. So I think in some ways, you don't even necessarily need to prove that they knew they were lying, although a ton of them knew, like a whole bunch of them knew. But what they absolutely knew is that the election had been certified and he lost by 11,000 votes. They knew that. Raffensperger told him that. The news reported it. Everybody knew that. He disagreed with it.
Right.
But whether or not that was an authentic disagreement or not, in some ways is beside the point.
That's what I find frustrating, though, is that jump from it's likely that, so if Raffensperger is telling Donald Trump, you don't have the votes, it's a pretty good piece of evidence that, frankly, you don't have the votes. This is a Republican talking to a Republican, and in all likelihood, you don't have the votes. And that goes to Rusty Bowers as well from Arizona, who was telling Donald Trump similar things. But Jack Smith and Fani Willis say, well, because Brad Raffensperger and Rusty Bowers had told Donald Trump and his legal team what they thought about the vote totals. He knew, and then everything he said differently from that was knowingly spreading false information because somebody had told him that. But the fact is, and as these indictments show, he has legal experts telling him different things. And to your point, Ryan, it's one of those. It's like, well, what do we know about what Donald Trump actually believed? And that's where legally it gets into different territory. For me, it just becomes it becomes really difficult to it becomes very difficult. The legal precedent for me becomes very difficult.
Yeah, and if we can put up this next Axios element, we're looking at a wild 2024 because you have all of these different court cases starting to line up with Iowa, New Hampshire, Super Tuesday, the Republican National Convention, and you're going to have them kind of weaving in and out of the political cycle in a way that's going to kind of never take this off the kind of news map for more than, say, a week. You're always going to have some type of motion or decision coming down in one of these different cases. And so, Emily, on the one hand, I feel like this helps Trump in the sense that it rallies Republicans around him. Also feel like it doesn't necessarily help him with a general electorate, which where he continues to erode support. So I'm wondering what your sense is of the politics. We've never come close to having a presidential election unfold and anything remotely like this.
No, and again, to the last point that we were debating a little bit, it's part of what makes me wish that this were happening at the ballot box. And I come from the perspective that, like, I wish we locked every politician up who did something bad, but the fact of the matter is we don't. And so when you have the public watching something like this play out, I think it creates a lot more rancor. We're going to be talking about this in the Hillary Clinton block coming up in a little bit, and we can probably go back and forth on it more then. But when you look at this calendar and you look at what's happened since the first indictment came down in April, Donald Trump's numbers and the gap between him and any other candidate has gone up. So it helps Trump in the primary, might not help him in the general, but the reason it helps him in the primary is that I think it's for the same reason it helps whatever candidate, likely Joe Biden, is matched up with Donald Trump. This is the type of thing that energizes both bases, and then you have this middle of the country that's just like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? I think Donald Trump is nuts, and I think he has done all kinds of extra legal things. On the other hand, I'm looking at Joe Biden, who's got all kinds of issues of his own, whether that's cognitive problems, whether that's Hunter Biden problems, whether that's the economy, frankly. And so it pains me for the country thinking of looking at that Axios chart, looking at the calendar going forward, which if you're listening to this, if you find that Axios timeline, it might be worth looking up because it's incredible to look at how many court dates and how on earth even one person could balance a presidential campaign with these 4 indictments in all of these different jurisdictions over the next year or so. It is going to be, buckle up because we're in for a pretty wild ride.
Plus a golf schedule that he's got to work in there too. But the irony here, and I'm curious for your take on this, if he had done what every other president, ever throughout American history had done, which is to concede to the person who won, to say, you know what, Sleepy Joe got the best of me. I'll be back in 4 years. I feel like he would be the odds-on favorite, not just to win the Republican nomination, that was his for the taking, but to win the White House again. I feel like the Democrats would be running scared that Biden would be, at least several points behind him. Instead, the guy's looking at various prison terms, and it's also hurting him with the general electorate. Where do you think he would be if he would have just said, you know what, he got me?
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. Two things. One, I agree if he had done that with the presidential election, he would be in a much more strong political position. And if he had, taken COVID more seriously all the way through, I think he would be in a stronger political position. And that's not to say I'm not trying to get into lockdowns or masking or anything, but just it devolved into something because in some sense he was being attacked as being, X, Y, and Z, and he lashed out and responded in ways that I think, made it more difficult for the country to approach the serious crisis that was killing lots and lots of people. And so the problem is you just can't separate that from the things that make Trump politically successful. The things that make him successful are also his downfall. It's like a Greek tragedy that plays out every single day on True Social now. And so you can't really have I just don't see how you can have the one part of Trump
Right.
without the other part of Trump, which is where, again, like a problem with both of these indictments, Smith and Willis, legally, and I think just as like a strategy as well, is that it's saying that Donald Trump was acting. I think they're taking him as a rational actor who, when the Secretary of State, who's a Republican, tells you something, you are like, oh, that is a very good piece of evidence that I lost the election. Whereas with Donald Trump, you see over and over again, and people I've talked to say if he believes anything, it's that he won that presidential election because he had Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and their people chirping in his ear, saying stuff, and that's who he chose to believe. He's like a he's a Twitter boomer. He was a Twitter boomer, and so the other thing I wanted to say, Ryan, is I agree with you completely on that Sidney Powell part about the Georgia voting machine. That's in the Fani Willis indictment, and that is extremely dicey material. That looks like it could be a real problem for her. Whether they got access to just like a password and it gave them access to the voting thing, that might be the case, but they knew that they weren't supposed to have it. It sounds to me from the evidence, and we'll see what evidence is presented in court, but it sure looked like they knew they weren't supposed to be entering the voter database from the back end there. And so I think that is a pretty serious part of the indictment too.
Yeah, it's not technically, I guess, classified information, but it's the same thing. One of the things that they're charging Julian Assange for is for helping Chelsea Manning kind of cover her tracks when she was looking through Pentagon files to leak to WikiLeaks. And so if for everybody who talks about two different tiers of justice, we have to remember that too. That anybody who tries to kind of penetrate an election system without legal access to it is committing a crime. Like that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, we can't have people. There's a great episode of Reno 911 where they try to go in and change votes on a referendum for police pay. There's a reason we
Can't have that. Yeah,
you can't have that.
Can't have a country here.
Right.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.